Well, welcome to our Pasture Weed and ID control. This is part of our livestock webinar series for the Southeast District, and we will go ahead and get started. Cora, if you'd thank you. So our first one is crestleaf groundsill. This is also known by butterweed or yellow ragwort, depending on where you live at and what the locals tend to call it. This is an annual plant with a hollow stem. It can be toxic when it is growing, and it's also toxic after it is dried. So if you have a lot of this in your pastures or in the areas that you're taking hay off of, it is toxic after dried. So it is important to make sure that we get rid of this weed. To identify it compared to other yellow flowering plants, be looking for a ribbed stem on the red and purple veins in the lower section of the stem. The next one is golden ragwort. This is a perennial. It is also toxic after it is dried. The leaves are often purple. This one is a little bit different than the first one because its leaves are a little bit shorter at 1 to 6 inches long versus the other one that is usually 8 inches or longer. And the best method of control for this weed is 2,4-D and spraying that between late October and early November. All right, our next one is white snakeroot. And this one flowers August to October. It's a perennial and it is toxic to livestock as well. This one you can tell from bone set. There's a late bone set, which is a native that's a really good pollinator plant, and they're often confused. This white snakeroot grows in shady areas where late bone set does not grow as in as many shady areas as the white snake does. The best removal is hand pulling if it's a small clump. If it's larger, then it's best to spray this. The next is dwarf larkspur. In some areas, this is also called staggerweed. And it's really a larger problem for the states to the west of us, but it can be found in areas that are more wooded. So if you are allowing your livestock to graze in wooded areas, be on the lookout for this plant. It has 5 sepals on the flower, and one of those sepals is elongated, which makes it look more like a spur. And then the control method is really spraying it if you have it. Go ahead, Cora. All right. So this is spotted spurge. It can also be called sand mat. It has a prostrate growth. It's a summer annual. It, along with most of the other spurges, contain chemicals that are toxic when taken in large quantities. So be on the lookout for any type of spurge and get it out of your pastures and out of where you're getting your hay out of, so that you don't have it in where your livestock's going to consume it. The next one is Carolina horse nettle. This one develops rhizomes, and all parts of the plant are poisonous, and it is also poisonous when dry. So even if you have a couple of these where you're pulling hay out of, you want to make sure that you remove it from your hay so that it's not potentially consumed. When the leaves are crushed, they do emit a potato type of odor, and as it ages, the stems become more woody. So this can also be confused with ground cherry. Ground cherry is a little bit different. If you're looking at the fruiting structures, the fruit is actually in a paper membrane on ground cherry versus Carolina horse nettle. The next one is climbing nightshade. It may also be called bittersweet nightshade. This plant, if left alone, can reach up to 10 feet tall. And we're looking at lobed leaves as an identifying characteristic, and it has bright red fruit. It's often confused with eastern nightshade. It's best if you can remove this by hand. If you do remove it by hand, make sure that you remove all the other stems because it is notorious for resprouting. Black locust is our next plant, and while it's probably not going to be in your hay fields because you're going to be mowing those continuously, It could be along the edges of your fields, along a fence line. So it's up to 100 feet when mature. It has a compound leaf and stipules at the base of the leaf petioles that turn into spines. So again, not only is it poisonous, but it could also be a little dangerous to animals in terms of pricking them. Ohio Buckeye is the next one. Again, a tree, so probably not in the middle of your pastures unless it's providing shade, but definitely along those fence lines. And most parts of it are toxic. So the buds, the nuts, the leaves, the bark, and the seedlings are all toxic. And this leaf is really how you identify it from other trees. Sundial Lupine is our next plant, and it's a perennial herb. Again, you're probably not going to see it too often in your hay fields because you're mowing them pretty frequently. It's found along the wooded edges. Identifying characteristics are the distinctly divided leaves that are arranged palmately, and the very attractive flower. So a lot of our plants, we don't see maybe this pretty of a flower on them. This is how you tell it apart from other plants. Horsetail. We tend to get lots of calls about this one. It is a perennial. It's a spreading rhizome. This one is unique in that there's two stem forms. So there is the erect leafless cone bearing stem. And then later on, you get what you see in the photo there where it is more, there's more branches to that stem. So there's two different stem forms. Usually it's found in wet areas, and it may be confused with a rush, which looks very similar to it. The scourging rush, though, is found exclusively in ditches and other wet areas, where horsetail is not necessarily found in all wet areas. Gemstone weed is a summer annual, and it is identified by its large white to purple flowers. It has a very distinctive odor, and its fruit is egg-shaped, and the fruit has little prickles on it. It is often confused with common cockerel when the plants are young. Common milkweed. This is one that it's a great pollinator plant, and as agriculture progressed, it became known as a weed because it grows in our fields and in our hay pasture. We don't want it at because it is toxic to livestock. It has very deep rhizomes, so just simply cutting it will not cause it to die. You will have to treat it. It can be confused with hemp dogbane. The best way to control this is to spot or use wiper applications of glyphosate on it, especially when they're smaller plants. Common pokeweed or pokeberry, depending on where you live at in the state, is a really tall perennial at about 10 feet tall. This is poisonous to livestock. It's also poisonous to humans. A lot of young children tend to mistake the berries for blueberries and therefore then get sick. But the identifying characteristics are those really dark purple berries and the reddish purple stem. Poison hemlock. This is one that we have really take off in the last few years. Is also known as poison parsley or spotted hemlock. And the entire plant is poisonous even when it's dried. It's a member of the carrot family, and it's a biennial. So when we're going to control this plant, it's really best if we can catch it in its first year of growth when it's a rosette before it has a chance to set flower the next year. Next is Canada thistle or Canadian thistle. And this one is going to flower from June to August. And we know there's a lot of thistles out there. And the way to tell it apart from the others is that its flowers are about 3/4 inch in diameter. And that's much smaller than the other thistles that we tend to see. Purple loosestrife or spike loosestrife. Hopefully no one has this because it's been on our invasive species list for quite some time for the state of Indiana. It's going to flower June to September, and its real identifying characteristic is that it has a square stem. Next is Multiflora Rose. Again, this is on Indiana's invasive species list. Looks like many of your rose bushes that you would find in your landscape. This one, though, quite an aggressive woody shrub, and we want to get rid of it. It used to be used as a living fence, so that's why we still have problems with it, because it had a purpose at one point until we figured out that it was not the greatest plant to be using as a living fence. Burr Cucumber is our next plant, and it could also be considered star cucumber. So this is a summer annual vine, and the stems are sticky hairy. Looking at the fruit, it's oval to elliptical, and the surface is covered with long, stiff bristles. So if you're wondering if you have a regular cucumber that you eat or a Burr cucumber, looking at that fruit to identify it is the best option. Shatter Cane is next. This is a summer annual, and it has a corn-like stem. It doesn't, unlike Johnson grass, it does not grow by rhizomes. It can be confused with Johnson grass, which is our next plant. Johnson grass is a perennial, and its panicles are a purplish color, so that's how you tell Shatter Cane and Johnson grass apart. And you can also tell by this photo that Johnson grass doesn't exactly have that corn-like stalk that Shatter Cane had. All right. Cora.
All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about methods of controlling pasture weeds. And one of the primary methods that is used is grazing. So controlled grazing allows beneficial plants to become strong, productive plants and outcompete the weeds. It gives the beneficial plants the opportunity to rest after grazing and then grow undisturbed until grazing again. So similarly, we can mechanically graze by mowing for hay. So that's a very similar way to control the weeds in a pasture. Mob grazing is high stocking rates in small paddocks that can force animals to consume forages like weeds that are difficult to control in other ways, but it can cause problems if some of those toxic weeds that Gina was talking about are present and those animals don't have any other feed, so they might start eating some of the toxic plants, and that could be problematic. Soil fertility is a good way to help control pasture weeds. Regular soil testing helps you know what the pH is in your pastures or your hay fields. pH below 6.0 favors weed growth and doesn't help out your grasses and legumes. Adding lime to low pH can help bring the pH up, and if you need any resources about that, you should contact your local extension educator. Mechanical control, like I said, mowing, clipping, and hand weeding can diminish weed infestations. I know Gina was talking about some specific types of weeds should be hand weeded. You want to mow in the early bud to early bloom stages before seed production. So it's really important that you know what plants you're controlling, because if you don't know when they're going to bloom, then you don't have as much control over managing those weeds. Mowing weakens the weeds by depleting their root reserves and prevents the spread of seeds. Timing is critical, and that's true of all weed control options. It's not just the mowing, but also the chemical control that we'll talk about later. Some weeds may produce a second seed head during the same growing season, so that's something to consider as well. Canada thistle even produces a second seed head really close to the ground, so that may make mowing to control Canada thistle really difficult. Mowing some woody plants like wild cherry can be problematic, as the wilted leaves can become toxic to livestock, and so it's important to know to identify those weeds in your pastures before you control using mowing. Tillage and reseeding is usually a last resort, as it is really costly and time consuming in an existing pasture. Although if you are wanting to do some pasture renovation, that might be a good time to till up some weedy problem spots in your pastures. As far as chemical control, you should always develop a plan before you go about it. So making those IDs is really important. And it can be a challenge to chemically control, because selective and non-selective herbicides are going to control different species. So it's always important to read the label. not only for the safety tips that are very important and necessary for your use of any chemicals, but also because the label is going to tell you a lot of information about what species that herbicide can help control. And always use your extension educators as a good resource if you have any questions. For example, 2,4-D can be used to control thistles because they're a broadleaf, but it also can kill some of your desirable legumes, so you don't want to broad spray that on your field. Limited control of broadleaf weeds is what you're going to accomplish with most of your herbicides. They are usually post-emergence translocated herbicides, which means that if you spray the herbicide on your field, the weeds are going to take it in through their leaves and put it through their whole entire systems and die that way. It's greatly affected by the age of your weeds and your growing conditions. You don't want to broadcast broadleaf herbicides in your pastures, as it will also kill legumes, like I said. Instead, you should spot treat certain sections. However, large bare areas will invite more weed species to appear and diminish your pasture value overall. So you might want to take that opportunity to reseed those patches. This is especially true if you use non-selective herbicides. So a non-selective herbicide is going to kill everything where you spray it. So you want to make sure that you are reseeding after that, because you don't want those weed seeds to take advantage of that open space. Annual retreatment may be necessary for several years to obtain long-term control. Young and actively growing weeds are best controlled with herbicides. So once the plants get too large, the chemical controls get less effective. Make sure to reseed the bare area to prevent weed seeds in the seed bank from growing. And then again, go back to that label and be aware of your grazing restrictions, because some herbicides, all herbicides will list when you can re-enter, when animals can go back, when they're able to graze, when you can harvest it for hay, and then also animal withdrawal times before slaughter, as well as the best time of year for the best control. Again, ID of those plants matters a lot, because you can control summer annuals like lamb's quarter with translocated herbicides in the spring and summer. Rosettes of winter annuals like shepherd's purse should be treated in the fall or the early spring. Rosettes of biennial weeds like common burdock or simple perennials like dandelion should be treated in the fall or in the early spring before bolting. And then creeping perennials should be treated when actively growing and they have a large leaf area, ideally in the late summer. So identification is really essential to good weed control. Most of your problem weeds in your grass pastures are either biennial or perennial broadleaf weeds, so that can be a place where you can start. And there's some of our resources that we used for this presentation. Does anybody have any questions?
All right, well, seeing no questions, thank you for joining today. And just if you have questions, email Britt or any of us through Purdue Extension, and we will do our best to answer your questions.